Now, you might be wondering why the Essential Services Commission, and we're just a bunch of economists and accountants, engineers and lawyers, why this odd collection of people has become so keen on community engagement. And to answer that, I kind of have to tell you a bit of a personal story. So I've written a short paper which I'll put on our website if you're interested in having a look. So my interest in local government was awakened in 2010 when the Victorian government asked the Essential Services Commission to establish a performance reporting framework for Victoria's 79 local councils. No worries, I thought. This is our bread and butter. We've developed reporting frameworks for a wide variety of sectors over many years, so we know how to do this. Or so I thought. Local government proved to be the hardest challenge we'd encountered when it came to developing a performance reporting framework. It seemed that no matter what we suggested to the sector as we began our work, we were constantly being told we were wrong. Sometimes it was councillors who forcefully made the point that we did not understand local government. At other times, the message was delivered by the CEO, CFO or corporate director. How could it be? How could it be that we so fully misunderstood local government? Or maybe the real question was, why were we being perceived as so fully misunderstanding local government? I hadn't encountered that type of reaction to our work before. But those questions led me on a fascinating voyage of discovery. I became intrigued by local government. I would spend my weekends walking around our neighbourhood, studying our town hall and other civic infrastructure. I haunted second-hand bookstores and the libraries at Melbourne and Monash universities in search of books on the history of local government. I searched the internet, tracing legislation back hundreds of years, not just in Victoria, but in New South Wales, before there was a Victoria, and Great Britain, before there was even a New South Wales. I was looking for something, an answer to a question, and it even took me some months to fully understand the question itself. Eventually, the question started to take shape in my mind. What is local government there to do? At first blush, that seems like a fairly straightforward question. I'm sure each one of you could corner me for 2 or 3 hours to tell me exactly what your council is doing, what services you deliver, what infrastructure you maintain, what projects you have with your community or business partners, what you are currently negotiating with state or federal government, and so on. I'm sure everyone here knows exactly what they are doing or what they need to do when they get back to the office tomorrow. I don't doubt that you know exactly what you're there to do. But that doesn't quite answer my question. Another way of interpreting my question might be, how do you know? And I don't mean you as individuals, but I mean you as the local government sector. How do you know that what you're doing is what your sector is meant to be doing? I spent many weekends over many months searching for an answer to my question. I'm not sure I ever really found the answer I was looking for, but I ended up writing a paper about my adventures and I delivered it at a local government conference back in 2010. It was also published in Administration Today, and it's still available on our website. I reread it the other day for the first time in a few years, and I still reckon it's a good yarn and worth a read. And just as an aside, that paper led to a rather colourful stoush between me and the Auditor General at the time, but that's another story. Our work on establishing a performance monitoring regime involved a great deal of consultation with councils and ratepayers. We delivered a final report to the government in 2010. Soon after, a newly elected government asked the department to take our work and, subject to further consultation, implement a statewide reporting framework. Over time, that morphed into what is now known as the Local Government Performance Reporting Framework, or the LGPRF, which has now been in place for a number of years. For a while, that was the end of our work in local government. That is, until the next election in 2014, when we were asked to advise government on developing a rate capping framework. we again conducted a wide-ranging inquiry and consulted closely with the sector and ratepayer organisations. We provided our report to the government, which then implemented what came to be known as the Fair Go rates system. And for the record, we were nowhere near imaginative enough to have come up with that name. Given our previous experience working with the local government sector, this time we had a much better appreciation of the complexities and ambiguities that surround local government. We knew we could not take our usual approach. In other sectors, whether it be electricity, gas, water, the Port of Melbourne, freight rail, taxis or tow trucks, the first thing we would do when setting up a pricing framework would be to define the services that the relevant sector existed to deliver. Let me repeat that last sentence. The first thing we would do would be to define the services that the relevant sector existed to deliver. Our earlier experience told us that it was not possible, at least in the absence of alternative legislation, to define the services that the local government sector existed to deliver. Now, this is a very important point that I'm making, because what we were being asked to do was, in effect, develop a pricing regime without first being able to define what we were pricing. This presents something of a dilemma. How are we meant to price something that we knew we could not define? As I said, this presented us with a real and difficult challenge. How could we make recommendations about rate capping? In other words, how could we put a price on the services delivered by local government if there was no outline or universal agreement about what those services should be? It would be like me saying to you, I want you to tell me how much you're prepared to pay for what's in my pocket. But I can't tell you exactly what's in there. You don't know whether it's a diamond ring or a jelly bean. So how could you go about the task of pricing it? The way we went about our task of developing a rate capping framework was to say, we're not going to guess what's in the pocket. Or more specifically, we're not going to try and define the services that councils should or are providing their ratepayers. We accepted that as a legislative framework stands, it is up to councillors and their staff to decide what activities they should be undertaking. However, having made that decision, we needed to find another way to deal with the challenge put to us by government, namely, finding a way to know whether councils are pricing their services reasonably. That is, whether their rates are fair and reasonable in the circumstances. Before I explain how we solved that dilemma, I need to digress briefly to quickly discuss our role from a broader governance perspective. We never thought it was workable for the Commission, the Essential Services Commission, to receive applications from each council each year for the rates they wanted to levy. That would have meant we needed to build a massive bureaucracy to manage 79 annual applications. But even more importantly, giving us such a role would have dangerously undermined and blurred each council's responsibility for service delivery and the council's accountability to its community. We were not prepared to blur that line. Councils are, and always should be, fully accountable for the activities they undertake and the rates they levy to fund those activities. However, at the same time, we also had the state government, on behalf of the broader community, expressing concern that council rates were not reflecting prudent expenditure decisions or efficient operating practices. So we were caught in the middle. We couldn't blur the lines around council's duties to their communities by injecting ourselves into the decisions that rightly lay with councils, yet the state government was expecting us to play a role in policing rates to ensure they were fair and reasonable. How did we solve that dilemma? Well, we stepped back. We said to councils, you decide on what you need or want to spend your ratepayers' money. We won't judge the wisdom of that expenditure. That's your call. But we also said that if you want to increase your rates above a statewide rate cap, which, as you know, is now set by the Minister for Local Government, if you want to go above that cap, then you need to satisfy us that you have made every reasonable effort to ensure that the higher rate is clearly required. We developed a number of principles for how councils should show us that they had indeed made every reasonable effort to ensure that the higher rate was clearly required. The principles we recommended were subsequently written into the legislation as the 2 statutory objectives and 6 legislative matters governing the fair go rate system. That's in the legislation. I don't have time today to discuss each of these matters, but we are here to discuss one of the legislative matters listed in the legislation, namely that when making an application for rate increases above the rate cap, councils need to show how the views of ratepayers and the community have been taken into account proposing the higher cap. Although it's quite a simple principle, many people, particularly councillors, took significant exception to the inclusion of this principle. They argued that they were elected to make decisions on behalf of their communities, and therefore, because they were democratically elected representatives, any expenditure or rate increase they proposed had, by definition, already taken the views of ratepayers and the community into account. Now, that's a big argument to make, and I expect you will each have a view on whether an elected official, once elected, really does represent in toto the views, interests, concerns and priorities of their communities. As I said, it's a big argument, too big an argument for me to entertain today. But in the end, my view about the strength of this argument doesn't matter. In the end, the government and Parliament of Victoria instructed the Essential Services Commission that when considering a rate increase application, we needed to consider whether the views of ratepayers and the communities had been taken into account. Which brings us to today's forum on community engagement. How does a council wanting to increase rates above the minister's rate cap demonstrate to the Commission that the views of ratepayers and the community have in fact been taken into account in proposing the higher cap? Clearly, the first step must be for councils to consult with their communities and to engage with the community's interests and concerns. Notice how I've used the words consult and engaged to mean slightly different things. For me, consultation is a process. It's the act of finding out what someone thinks about something. Consultation can be done in many different ways: workshops, focus groups, surveys, deliberative forums and citizens' juries, just to name a few. Consultation is the process, and it is an important process. But notice how the legislation doesn't just require that councils consult with their ratepayers and communities. It goes further than this. The third legislative requirement, the one highlighted there, doesn't simply state that councils need to demonstrate they have consulted with their ratepayers and communities. Instead, it goes further. It goes further because, as I said, consultation is just a process, albeit a very important one. But what happens next is even more important. Having found out what ratepayers think about something, the real question then becomes, how do you, as councils, engage with the views, interests, concerns and priorities of your communities? How do you turn your mind to the desires, aspirations and anxieties expressed by your communities? How do you actively engage with those interests, desires and concerns? How do you make those concerns your concerns? I want to be absolutely clear. Actively engaging with those interests, desires and concerns does not mean you or your councillors will necessarily agree or accede to those interests, priorities, desires or concerns. Nowhere does the legislation require councils to prove to the Essential Services Commission that councils have garnered widespread community support for their expenditure proposals. In the end, it's up to councillors who are, as I've already discussed, democratically elected to decide which of those interests, desires or concerns they act on and which they do not. Only they can make that decision. That's why they are elected. And again, as I've already emphasised, we do not want to intrude or intervene in their responsibility for making those decisions. That would blur the lines of responsibility and it would leave no one accountable for community outcomes. However, given the role the Parliament has asked us to play, we need a demonstration of not just how councils have consulted with their constituents, but how they have engaged with those interests, desires and concerns revealed through that consultation process. We need to see how councils have deliberately and deliberatively turned their minds to those concerns. That's why Legislative Matters number 3 includes the words taken into account. Everything hinges on those 3 little words, taken into account. I have written to councils on a number of occasions to highlight what we, as the Commission, need to see, that we need to see 4 things when we assess whether a council has taken into account the views of its ratepayers and community when making an application to us. In short, these are: how did the council consult with its ratepayers and community? What methodology did you use? And why did you adopt that approach? We're not telling you which approach, that's council's decision, but why did you adopt that approach? What did the council learn about the views of its ratepayers and community? So what information did you collect? What wisdom did you gather? 3, how is the council responding to those views and why? So here's what we've heard, here's how we plan to respond, and here are our reasons for responding in that way. And then 4th, how is the council addressing unmet expectations? Of course, when you've got a council of a few thousand, or maybe a few tens of thousands, or even these days a few 100,000 ratepayers, you are never ever going to meet everyone's expectations. That is impossible. So how are you going to deal with the unmet expectations that are revealed through your consultation processes? Now, I appreciate these are easy questions to ask. As we all know, they are not easy questions to answer. That's why we've gathered here today, to discuss how we might go about answering these questions and doing so in a way that supports and confirms a council's planning processes and, where need be, to support an application for a rate increase above the rate cap. Thank you for coming along today. It's bound to be a very interesting discussion. I urge you to share your experiences with other attendees, your successes and your not so successful efforts, and we've all had our fair share of those. Share your glories and your war stories. It's going to be a great day, so thank you again.